The tempo. What a feeling. I often find that to teach it is not to count, that is to not lose it, is to imagine it in your head before you start playing on the piano, but you don't have a conductor. So you have to establish a tempo in your mind before your fingers play it. And since most of my students happen to learn how to play through their fingers memory, unless they touch the keyboard and the resistance of the action of the keyboard, the tempo comes in as a sequence or consequence to their desire to play in depth in the keys in order to obtain the legato of the singing aria style of slow movements, especially in concerti with orchestra. And I find that when you want to find the right tempo, it's a traction, it's a motion. So it's more about the pulse, it's more about the delay and the phrasing, as well as the breathing points, which you have to establish artificially to the pianists, but which are the natural spots where a singer would take a breath or a wind player would take a breath. All these are easy to say things, of course, and I share them with you because I find that all of us who deal with music in terms of imagining it, performing it, or perhaps composing it, at some point or another we have to define the pace of it. And the pace of it depends also of acoustics, and I'm sure all of you know that too. And I always think there is no absolute tempo. There is only tempo that suggests capacities of reproducing the inner hearing of the piece. No wonder conductors give an upbeat of the tempo to be. And pianists never do an upbeat to themselves. It would be actually sort of ridiculous to watch. And pianists don't have conductors unless there is an orchestra with them. Though it might be interesting to experiment a pianist going on stage to play a solo recital and saying to the audience, and this is my conductor, facing the pianist and giving the departure, arranging the ritenutos, making sure the tempi go again, merging in the traffic of the next section. It would be natural for a chamber orchestra. It would be natural, of course, you have some orchestras who manage to play without conductor, but generally the conductor is the one you delegate to the pulse, the flow, the departure and the stop, the eventual flexibility. And if you do it alone on the piano, it's kind of silly to need a conductor because that means you cannot play and count at the same time. But very often the texture of the complexity technically doesn't allow that. So what do? I admit that every time I hear performers who convince me that the tempo corresponds to their quality of touch, expression of line, it corresponds to their musicianship. The same tempo might not fit for somebody else who doesn't have the same depth of keyboard touch or something. It's very interesting how all these elements have to enter in account, and then when people write on the scores a tempo, people assume that's a universal tempo. I mean, the greatest feel is that people who can play in the real tempo that they consider be the right one can remain flexible like tectonic plates that slightly move without to create an earthquake, and adjust and adapt to the texture for the mood that the tempi create. Because for some sections it's too slow, for some sections it's too fast. And the composer often doesn't say più mosso or meno mosso. Sometimes they do, but mostly they don't. And I don't speak of the expressive rubato, I speak of long sections, thematic or otherwise. And I find that to be very interesting because then you can find a way to define where you can come back to the tempo that you might have lost in order to express different textures. For instance, less notes, more notes in terms of busyness of texture. And then when it's very busy in texture, you can slow down. It won't appear like you're slowing down because it gets busier in declarative 30 seconds compared to singing eighth notes. Stylistically, we tend to be more rigid in the tempo for the classical era, the Baroque era before, or the galant before the romantic after the classic. In other words, we have ideas about what fits where and what is good taste and bad taste to do. But since anyway, the soloist playing alone doesn't have a chamber group or an orchestra to be in agreement with, the tempi can be very interesting. In any case, the tempi are very difficult to define unless you perform. When you conduct, since you don't play the instrument, you don't have the reaction of the instrument playing to take in account, only the cerebral understanding of the tempo. And you implement it ahead of a beat of the musicians in the orchestra or the ensemble that you conduct. Whenever when you play alone, you're inevitably responsible for yourself. There's no other one. And so to manage to keep a tempo while evolving through the different sections to adjust and adapt to the exact mood atmosphere that they demand, and then find ways where you can return to the original tempo without to appear like you're doing so using a section with more notes or less notes. In a way, it's by experience. And when you hear performances where you think is so stable and beautifully reassuring the pace for the listener of the tempo, that the performers are just so serene, especially in slow movements where they can sing, express emotion and lyricism on the piano. But in fact, if you put a metronome to listen to it, you realize that no, they're not. They're not keeping the tempo, it's an illusion. But it is very interesting to help the students find how not to slow down while playing slow, how to not rush when they play fast, because a lot of the tempo is determined by their muscular memory of the finger practice. You can't without it, but you should make sure that it doesn't rule you. You rule it. I accompany them on the second piano for the concerti, and I don't do the accompanies trying to match the soloist, because orchestras are an entity of many people who follow their own structure of playing and their part. So the conductor hyphenates, well, should hyphenate with the soloist, but not always. And sometimes when I accompany, therefore, on the second piano to give them the feel of what it feels to have an orchestra like a herd and you're the one, I rush or I slow down without to care about the soloist, to see how they'll deal with it, because they'll discover it but at the rehearsal, which is almost too late, or panically to adjust. And so if they can adjust in real time, it's better. I give them the benefit of the experience. They think I exaggerate, nothing but returning on the downbeat in synchronization. Conductors ask, give me the beat, and you tell them, but my teacher told me not to accent all the beats. That's the point of the beauty of the articulation, for instance. And they say, it doesn't matter, I need the beat because they don't want to be out of sync. Especially at the end of a trill, at the end of the cadence, they want to make sure they connect with you. And so you have to be readable in your articulation, you have to be readable in your impulse for the downbeat that you suggest through your playing. If the concerto is full of syncopations like Schumann concerto, you're always offbeat. but at the same time you have to be also leading in accordance to the conductor. Of course, you can also conduct from the piano, but that is much harder for the technique of playing piano. In fact, muscles get tired. You use a lot of abrupt movements with your arms to organize the tempo and keep it. And then when you have to play very subtle articulations of 16th notes, lightness, your muscles in your arms are exhausted. So in fact, it's not that obvious a technique to conduct from the piano. Best is, I believe, to have a pianist conductor. So this way, they they know which are the sections and the traps in the piece. I mean, most of the conductors are not pianists, though some are. Mostly could be violinists or string players, because in fact they attend to the culture of the orchestra playing, since they work in orchestras most of their professional life at some point or another. So to conduct is to learn how to organize the building of the concert procedures, the rehearsals, what to say, how to say, what to expect, how to be diplomatic while in high expectation. Things that pianists don't know, since they spend their time practicing alone, even without or with a recording. It's already pre-cooked. But when the conductor is there and the soloist is there, then the conductor is supposed to hyphenate with the orchestra to make sure that the complex syncopations connect in the right place. And that also is a question. Where is the downbeat? Is it in between the up and down? Is it on the bottom of the beat? Or is it just at the beginning of the beat? Sometimes you can beat very small gestures, sometimes very deep, to, to bring the fruit of the sound blossomed through a dotted eighth note or a dotted quarter note if it's rhythmically extended before the release of a shorter note. I think all these elements have to be taken in account for the elegance of the expression, the drive, or sometimes the violence expressed in the music, like a Beethoven Symphony number 5, for instance, or 9. It's a tremendous drive of will. The more subtle things to conduct are the lighter things, the things that are transparent, almost unmarked with an up or down beat pulse or some kind of indication of where is your punctuation. Ravel's concerto for that is quite something. And noticeably, the concerti composed by pianists like Mozart, Rachmaninoff, Liszt, Chopin, Schumann, who wasn't, Beethoven, who was, but not in our virtuoso understanding of the word, and Tchaikovsky, not at all. For instance, compared to Scriabin, who was more than, and Mettner, not to mention, or this virtuosity with depth of musicianship combined. Musicians are then organists, but mostly pianists. When they write, like Rubinstein, their own concerto, of course, is virtuosity oriented and lyrically oriented. Perhaps less symphonic, though not always. César Franck, especially, who was an organist, but compared to him, Saint-Saëns, wow. The piano is like fireworks of arpeggio, scales, lightness, happiness, depth, drive. It's like Liszt on amphetamines. Liszt is already very driven. But to play these composers' concerti, you feel like you're playing their pianism, not only their thoughts, not only their imagination for compositions, but they think through their fingers, let's put it this way. Liszt's octaves, Rachmaninoff chords, Schumann syncopations, Mozart opera arias, Tchaikovsky ballet symphony music. Grieg, that is the perfect concerto in balance of bravura, a sense of very strong heroism of the ultimate romanticism time period. After that, you get the concerti like Prokofiev and Bartok and forward in our time, where the piano is more percussive than lyrical. It's less corresponding to the expectations of the Romantic era concerto, where the heroism is the army of one, the soloist, versus the group. So you have interactions, you have prevailing, and sometimes the piano prevails literally over the orchestra dynamically, which was impossible in Mozart's time because that was extended chamber music, given the instrumentarium and the power of the instruments in terms of volume. So in a way, the instruments create also their own rapport of dynamic range, which then creates the rapport of the thematic material in terms of expression of heroism or drive. That's so beautiful, though, to be able to capture in your touch the style and the genre that is evocative of. Naturally, pianists have to study the concerti like sonatas until the rehearsal, while the orchestra in the beginning disturbs them or worries them or makes them feel like they're in a very, very rigid cage rhythmically, because there's so many and you're always afraid as a soloist you're going to get off of track. But once you know the piece in terms of the experience of having played it in one rehearsal, already the next rehearsal you lead subtly while you listen to them selectively in order to lead them with the conductor towards a given accelerando, a given rubato that starts being less rigid and therefore less afraid or cautious to be not together, the famous fear of dislocation gone. Then you just go together, the group and you, in the same direction of excitement with a sense of freedom. And even some of the beats not totally together connect finally the dots towards the aim towards which both go. That, I think, is something that is magnificent when you feel it. You feel the orchestra like an excitement as well as a partner rather than a judgment. Oh, you're out of tempo. Oh, you're out of beat. Oh, we're no more together. That's for details, like the endings of concerti with trills, as I said, for the cadenzas. But when you have a accelerando build up on 20, 30, 40 bars together with an orchestra, wow, that's exciting. You feel like you excite them, they excite you, and you're all excited by the music itself. It's like a uplifting, amazing uplifting. So in the cadenza of the Schumann concerto, which starts like this, at the end, the piano ostinatos with the trills, and the orchestra enters and builds up the coda excitement from this. So you build up the accelerando and the crescendo. Obviously, you feel that incredible energy that the orchestra and the soloist are fueling together. like heard the orchestra on the downhill, and the same way the running soloist also towards the common aim. And same thing happens at the end of the Tchaikovsky concerto when you have the cadence. Ending. And the orchestra plays the theme. And then progressively builds up that excitement. And so what I want to say is that at some point of this pickup of energy, which is exchanged and competing between the soloist, the one, the orchestra of one, the army of one, that's the analogy, and the orchestra, the herd, the group, you feel like they are mutually exciting each other into arriving to the culminant point of excitement, of crescendo, accelerando, rising. Yeah. So obviously this situation is not a sonata, it's not a symphony. In fact, it's both. And at that point, the conductor is supposed to hyphenate with the orchestra to follow the soloist leading the accelerando gradual or step by step. At the same time, what is the artist's soloist capacity to be heard? Not by the orchestra musicians who are too spread around to hear you, but they, of course, funnel their attention to the conductor, who has one hand for them, one hand for you as a soloist. So perhaps you follow the conductor as a soloist, and you should. But at the same time, in your playing, you should lead. When you do the phrasing by two, you insinuate, you hint innuendos of subphrasings, which are sort of little breaks within the general flow of going forward faster and faster. More so in the Schumann coda after the cadenza than in Tchaikovsky, which goes by several levels of dropping. There are no speed bumps like when you drive in the neighborhood and you have to slow down. It's more about little hills and then big drops, and this way you finalize the excitement. You have to also realize that I think the tempo is also a question of energy more than of speed. Energy in the consumption of the notes, not the dynamic range per se, because you can have a great accelerando without crescendo, though it's rare, but it exists. It's more about the harmonic progression going faster, the harmonic rhythm going faster. For instance, in the Ballade number 4 by Chopin, before the coda you have this apoplexic. I purposely separated them by subdivision of groupments of secondary dominants galore super fast that go so fast that they're meant to create a sense of vertigo in the listener, not by virtuosity of fingers, but by speed of secondary dominant successions. 5 of flat 2, German 6 into flat 4. Well, of course, that is only if you stop. So the harmonic rhythm of progression is so important in the ballad in question. Most of the times at the beginning of the piece, you have a harmony, change every 2 half dotted quarters. So you have the time to get accustomed to taste the harmonic progression. It gives you a soothing feeling, and at the same time, it allows us to listen to the oral presentation of the singing of the sweet texts in melodic lines. Sprachgesang, sang spoken. These are very important things to take in account. The harmonic progression, the harmonic tempo, the inharmonic progressions of some modulations, which come in a surprise. And that surprise is not just a surprise for the sake of it, it's an atmospheric change of mood that psychologically manipulates the listener, just like a very expressive and convincing orator does with their rhetoric in a speech. And the quality of delaying and teasing and preparing and then delivering and exploding the words almost like a device, in terms of the charged energy in the speech. And that's what Chopin knows so well in the coda. Of course, it sounds like a general mess, especially on this piano, I must confess. But if you take it slowly, what do you hear? Tonic, German 6, and augmented 6, therefore, of course. That prepares the dominant with a B natural that is foreign to flat F minor, it would have been. But and then you have the section with the chromatic thirds. But what is it mostly is a dropping semitones of diminished sevenths, unresolved and in sequence, and therefore they're double tritones anyway. So they give the illusion of an eternal fall, fatal fall, drop, impossible to catch up on, to hold on anything. When you reach to the first degree, 6th chord, first inversion in F minor, you feel like you hold for your life on this tonic after this incredibly vertiginous drop. But at least because of the chromatic quick articulation of ascending thirds that drop up, that's an interesting statement to say drop up. If they lift and drop out, it's an escaped. Could have been continued in the high register. Have as many octaves anyway. But the point is that what matters is not the rising of the escaped in the right hand thirds chromatically, is the drop by step and by bar of the harmonization, while the thirds in the right hand melodically rise chromatically. So you have the centrifuge of chromaticisms through diminished sevenths in both directions, exponentially expanding, creating a sense of chaos, of panic, of drama, of battle, of some kind of romantic Napoleonic Wars times battlefield, where you feel like everything is going in such tragic way, fast and fatal, and you cannot escape it. So he translates in his coda, yes, virtuosity for the pianist to play, which shows off, but through that there is in the tempo, therefore, of the harmonic progression plus the chromaticism, which is melodic but combined in the two hands at different speeds, a sense of chaos. So the tempo is not alone a part of the harmonization and a part of the melodization. They are combined, either to bring a sense of solace and calm, well-being, either to entice in a suspension, something is gonna happen, and then at some point all loose goes. And I think that of course we can talk about tempo in terms of clarity. Obviously in slower tempo you get it all when it's spelled to you syllable by syllable, but when it's played in the fast tempo, in which is meant to be, how fast is to be determined by the performer, partly according to the instrument's clarity capacity plus the acoustics. So the desire to be clear should in the performer's intent be more important than the effect of chaos that is created by the music itself. And that without to mention the nuclear action of the right foot pedal that can just make everything blurred. Or on the contrary, you have the time to hear the individual drops. But nobody in a concert hears this cadenza, Freudian slip, this coda alla cadenza, in that mayhem, musical mayhem expression, unless I take the time to explain it as I do. I wouldn't stop in performance to explain it to the audience. They don't expect me to do. They just expect me to just deliver it, and that Chopin chose how fast and in which direction and in which harmonization, but the very details of the how faster or how not too fast, it's still left to me. And if I'm in chamber music, then it's with the musicians and their bows or breaths that give them the limitation of how fast or slow it could go. And then you have the aesthetics of a conductor who thinks outside of the instrumentarium. They don't play, they don't touch, they don't vibrate the sound. They only think in terms of pulse and beats. So they're more cerebral intellectuals who conceive the series of bars as a sections, more like the analogy of a general in a battlefield who decides, let me move 1,000 people this way, we're going to gain this, we're going to lose this, we know how many losses we'll have. And so they strategize. What the conductor does, strategizing, beating always ahead in order to prepare for a ritenuto and accelerando or a stop. The musicians of the orchestra follow the conductor because he's the only one who has the GPS, in other words, all the parts in front of his eyes are memorized in the score, whenever all of the musicians have only their part. So they have to be behaving in order to be together, but they don't have the thinking outside of their part to know what happens in the whole piece, even if they contribute towards it. So somebody has to conduct who doesn't play in order to organize how people will play, how they'll manage to move from one point to the other. Then you add to that the unit of the soloist in the concerto. In this case, the pianist is the instrument that is not in the group. Like a violin concerto, you have 16 violins. Another instrument, cello, flute, oboe, you have one or two of them. Piano, no. So the pianist is the imported extra instrument. It's percussive, it's melodic, it's harmonic, it's a bit of all. He can sing, or pretends to, in the denial of pianists that they are not singers, but it can have a certain delay of the decay of the sound, which allows them to be lyrical or very fast percussive or very loud in order to create a sense of empowerment through the instrumental manufacture, that they can play, the orchestra plays, the orchestra piano goes. So you can create dialogue as well as a contradictory opposition, and then you can obtain also, like in the second concerto by Rachmaninoff, the melodies in the violin, in the low register on the fourth string, very warm sound, but the piano plays a complex group of arpeggios that nobody really hears except the harmonic, I would say, brooding arpeggiation. And then you have 24, 36 violins playing at the same time in unison. So the thickness, the depth of their sound is the mood of that kind of atmosphere. And then the piano plays arpeggios in the same low register that at the same time is sort of hovering around them. And you feel like that is the tempo determined not by them, but by you. Because you on the piano, you play sextuplets, octuplets, or whatever it is, and they play, but with a sustained vibrato and bow, the length of sound. So it sounds like a chorale for the strings, and the piano plays fast like an etude by Chopin. But in the low register. Say enough, and I think I say it often. So in fact, composer pianists have played other compositions, especially virtuoso piano pieces. And so Rachmaninoff played Tchaikovsky, and Chopin and Liszt played Chopin too. Of course, it's the same generation. But the ones that follow, like Grieg played Schumann, and Beethoven played Mozart concerto. And so you can feel, see, and observe how within the orchestra development in terms of their might and warmth of sound and projection of the woodwinds, brass, strings, and percussive sections when not together or combined with the acoustics of their big concert halls that become this kind of new Roman circus, if you want, of classical symphony music, where then the soloist with a more powerful instrument that is not part of the orchestra, the pianist, comes and plays pieces that exalt that kind of heroism where the hero is the individual who defeats the group, or who fights the group at equal levels of dynamic proportions, and then of course in the texture. And that idealization of the individual defeating the group, you know, the four musketeers, the hero, basically the idealized hero. That's the pianist. You can do that with the violin, but the violinist in a concerto is a soloist naturally, but as well as the greatest group of musicians in an orchestra are the violinists of group 1 and violin group 2 combined. So the soloist is in a way supported by a flock of his own birds, being a bird himself, let's say, in the high register and singing and rising, and of course by the sheer balance with the orchestration, by the composer's imagined balance, and of course on top of that the microphones in recordings being leveled so that you can hear the violin even more bigger than it is in proportion in reality in the recording, and so you can hear it more extracted from that group. But regardless, if it's the natural balance by the composer's orchestration organization of the powers and management of the powers, that's what I was searching as a word, and the other instruments who are alike, you obtain something where it's the herd and one of them in the front. And when it's the tutti all together, then it's one against all. And usually in that case, the solo instrument plays alone and the orchestra answers after a rest, abruptly right away, in kind of a confrontation, but not in an over speaking on each other, because a solo violin, a harp, solo oboe cannot sustain if the tutti of the orchestra plays forte. That's it. They are buried. Whenever the piano is able to sustain, the modern piano more than their forte piano, but progressively you can see that rising of expression in the piano concerti from Bach to Mozart to Beethoven to Schumann to Rachmaninoff, Prokofiev, and Bartok and Stravinsky and forward, where the percussive aspect of the instrument of the piano combined with its lyrical capacity. Look at the second theme of Tchaikovsky. It's to sing. And then when they play the first theme, Tchaikovsky uses it as a xylophone, as an instrument that is percussive with melodicity, but mostly percussive. And then here, pure chorale. So the piano concert soloist in Tchaikovsky is sort of like the magic instrument that is an orchestra and a soloist on top of everything and at the same time by the one performer. In the opening cadenza, he gives so much chords, so much arpeggios, so much just four notes of the opening introduction. Four notes, that is thematic material, but basically with the pedal and the resonance, the piano in the concert hall, while the orchestra is waiting to play, is exhibiting its might, which you don't have in a Mozart concerto. Where the concert pianist is not a soloist, well, yes, while it's more like an extraverted orchestra musician. I like that. For instance, you have in the 467 concerto, with or without extra cadenza, anybody could decide or not. And then on the trill, the orchestra presents the theme, and then the piano alone, very elegantly, is it still galant? Is it still classic? Is it in between? It's a little bit of both. It's just to be charming, seductive, elegant, and in a way not powerful in the sense of the pure energy of the sound production, projection of the instrument, rather be operatic soprano or tenor with quick enunciation of notes like in Italian, whatever they say, the singers enunciate. The piano also, that's what I call the air legato on the piano. And in the A major concerto, you have the sense of elegant well-being. And the second theme, a bit of chromaticism, most repeated notes, dotted notes, sequence, elegant exit, and the orchestra picks up. And very often the piano in the Mozart concertos, a solo part, does the decorative accompaniment of the orchestra. So the soloist in the Mozart concerto is half a time accompanying, embellishing the woodwinds, mostly dialoguing with the strings, and not always trying to be ahead to show off their own place as a soloist, but is soloist the rest of the time. So sort of shared situation between a large group chamber music in which the keyboard is the guest of the winds and the strings, and then the rest of the time is leading them. And that is so incredibly true at the end of the development of this concerto. Of course, on the piano played like this, it sounds very flat and uninteresting. But when you hear the instruments like flute, clarinet, bassoon, re, fa, all these suspensions, these dissonant suspensions, 7/6. Well, it's Bach basically, or his time period rather. And the piano, what does it do at the same time? Nothing. Pouring 16th notes over it, like sugar over the strawberries, or whatever analogy of, comes to mind to me, which is not always the most wise one. But let's say it is an observing instrument rather than being observed when it does this. In other words, the instruments. So for Mozart, the solo instrument doesn't have to be constantly in the concerto ahead, in the sense dynamically or thematically. It's very often also the accompanist of the soloist in the orchestra, who are the oboe, clarinet, oboe, woodwinds basically. And the orchestra of the strings, while not in great number in his day, even if today they are in a symphonic way, they're more like the Klangteppich, the German word for resonant ground or rug. And it is true that when you have these situations, you feel like the concerto has evolved from the concerto grosso, where the orchestra and the soloist were playing basically in unison, like in Bach, for all the introduction, which would be solo orchestra later in Beethoven. Whenever in Bach, is with the keyboard instrument, who is blending with the sound of the strings, and then it comes out little by little out of that cocoon of the orchestra. But it's not a flagrant contradictor, let less rhetorical hero. No, it's more like an extension of the orchestra. And with Mozart, it's an operatic combination where the characters that are so typical for the Italian opera of the soprano, the baritone, they all have their sort of predestined patterns of expression according to who is in the plot and who is the plot of the opera's scenario, libretto, sorry. Of course, that's the right word for an opera. Who is the fomenting and who is the victim, and then you have different types of arias and recitativos. So, in fact, without words, according to the Italianate opera style, Mozart in his concerti for piano is developing operas without words, and the leaps have the same effect as the soprano arias. Of course, I cannot sing. I'm sorry, I tried. That was silly of mine. But the point is that there is a genre that prevails over the genre for which you write. Beethoven writes quartets for strings when he writes sonatas for piano. Mozart writes operas when he writes concerto for pianos, especially when you have and then the big leaps of the soprano aria. And then Tchaikovsky writes symphonies or ballet music through his way of doing it. The steps of the dancers of the classic ballet, the melody of the aria. He is in an enchanted system of music writing, like incidental music for theater. And I believe that Mozart, in his own way, and Tchaikovsky in his own way, they would have written the most amazing soundtracks for films had the technology allowed this situation to be chronologically possible, because their imagination is fertile and their know-how is unbelievably effective. Meaning, you hear a Tchaikovsky 2/16 notes and you already are in the atmosphere that he wants to bring you for this or that scene of the ballet. And it doesn't take minutes or 16th notes or seconds to display it. It's just right away, immediate. You know where you are. And same thing with Mozart, with the concerti for the piano, or the symphonies, or the quartets, or they all are operatic. They immediately place you in a situation where you know who is proud and who is tragically losing. And like the opening of the D minor concerto, you plunged in the drama of Don Giovanni, and the piano brooding. And using the chromaticism as this struggle of human spirit to deliver themselves from their bad instincts, like for Don Giovanni in this case, with the moralization at the end of the opera, with the commander statue that comes to send him in hell. But during the whole opera, it's an explosion of excitements and joys where Don Giovanni is losing his soul while experiencing all the pleasures. And so Mozart is experimenting with this duality of the tragic and the burlesque, and the happy, but not the happy and joyful, the happy and desperate. And so the chromaticisms, all these elements in the piano, where the first entrance is to a tutti that started with this. Syncopations with slides in triplets of the double basses. Talk about unsettled. Schumann already had a master. Of course, he goes further when he goes in his concerto. 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. If you want to count it in hemiola, if not by beat, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. In which case you always fall on the beat, but with the hemiola you're off beat, constantly unsettled at what is Mozart. And to think that the D minor concerto, according to his own father of Mozart, in a letter, was rehearsed was performed without even being tried once, directly with the wet ink on the paper in the orchestra part. What do you think about that? What are these people, surhuman, better taught than us in terms of keyboard harmony, contrapoint, thinking polyphonically and all this? Yes, they were. Why? Because the values in musicianship were based a lot on the spontaneous and the acquired, when the two create a sense of elevation of the spirit. In a Bach Mass, in a Mozart Mass, in a Schubert Mass, in a Beethoven Mass, in any Haydn Mass, regardless of their styles, and look at the oratorios of Mendelssohn, and look at all the spiritual works written by most of the composers at some point of their life, the Symphony of Psalms of Stravinsky, and so on. What is it? Is that music as a grammar is there to be organized in its expression, but what does it express? The duality of the humanity versus the gods, the non-understanding of what is our destiny, and therefore the realization of our own sins, etc. Okay, this moralistic fact is one, but when we speak about the tempi since the beginning of this presentation. I want to say that the tempi are all the flag that carries all these elements of the innuendo with the tragedy or the elegance or the well-being or the complexity or the syncopations or the end, not only or, sometimes and, the virtuosity and the drive and the pure excitement of the drive of the pulse going faster and faster. And so therefore the tempo is not fixed. You could say, oh, okay, the Ninth Symphony Beethoven discovered through the metronome, Melzel metronome, the tempo marking. In the scherzo of the Ninth Symphony, he didn't put retroactively tempi after he discovered the metronome's objective tempo indication for his sonatas for piano or chamber music or any, but there's some fewer earlier symphonies. So, okay, we don't have that. But what do we have? We have the innuendo. I think is more strong than anything. Of course, you have tradition. Germanic conductors conduct allegros in andantes, and Italian or Mediterranean type conductors, because of their temperament, in fact, conduct allegros as prestos. After all, it's in the eye of the beholder. Why hierarchize or constantly judge and say, oh, they're wrong, or I'm right and they're wrong? I think there are ways to, if there is a coherence in the message, in the way it's delivered, and you can disagree with it, but you cannot not accept that it's valid, even if it's parallel to yours and possibly contrary to yours. Listen, the presto of the D major sonata by Beethoven. So what do you think? Why is it not? If it's presto, it's rushed. What is rushed? I don't know. I don't have the tempo marking through the metronome or beats a minute. Fine. So it's cut time in 2 beats, a bar, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. If it was in 4/4, I will do 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So obviously the notation, the choice of the meter, has something to do with the tempo of the expression of the interpretation, which at the time corresponded also to improvisation and transcription all in one. There are different type of devices that defined the interpretation by the personal input into the piece, which was expected, and by the listeners who were informed, and by the composer who offered a space in the piece to express yourself, to respect the performer who will play it. But since all performers until the 20th century were composers themselves, either if they played in the orchestra of Mozart sight reading concerti afternoons in the Sundays in the park in Vienna, and in a way correcting a prima vista in sight reading the inevitable mistakes that can be done in copying parts when not rehearsed, proves that their level of grammar knowledge, because of their level of education, was perhaps, not even perhaps, most likely technically for the instrument playing lower, but their level of pure musicianship was higher. I don't speak about the talent and the drive and the genius for some like Mozart, obviously, but I speak about the know-how, how to manipulate, how to organize, how to put together, how to bring out, in other words, if all performers are composers, then authenticity is no more a question. You don't need editions or publishers to tell you what is right from what is wrong. Recite it or get out of there, because they don't give you the tools to think outside of the box. Perhaps it's preferable for you to be not that, but if you learn all the technique of musicianship, then you divert from the hours of practicing repetitively to gain the pure technique of playing. And since the two take time, and they're not always compatible in terms of what is repetitive and what is to be studied and what is to be repeated and reproduced. One is more muscular memory, another one is more intellectual memory, and you have to at one point train your ear to recognize which goes where, how they combine, and you have to try in real time to harmonize, in real time to keep the tempo, to feel the phrasing, the groupment of beats, of bars, of tempo indications as moods most of the time compared to the objective metronomic factor. But nevertheless, tempo is probably the way you sort of put together all these elements harmonic, melodic, polyphonic, and naturally virtuosic. So I think that the tempo is not only to say I can play faster than you or I can play slower than you. Is why should I, and towards which goal do I use, which tradition that allows me to think so. For instance, out of 27 concerti that Mozart left us for keyboard and orchestra, there's only one that is adagio in its middle slow movement. All the others are fast, slow, fast, but only number 23 is an adagio with a Siciliana dance dotted rhythm in 6/8. If it were andante, does it mean that I would immediately try to think, okay, adagio was in two words, at ease in Italian originally. Now, in the metronomic hierarchy of Melzel's metronome, it's under andante, which means walking or pacing calmly, like taking a walk rather than walking to catch a train if you're late. I would be a Siciliana in andante to my taste. It's slightly more agitated because faster notes play quicker and decay less, so it becomes more busy than when they were adagio like this. Possibly more spelled rather than said in terms of the oratorian skill, but also creating a mood of greater devotion or possibly reflection. Now, who is wrong? Who is right? I think everybody is right. As long as they play it with conviction. And what I mean by there is that they don't sound like repeating or reciting what they're told, what's written, what they're supposed to do, because in a way they follow rules, but they don't seem to be animated as if they composed it, if they are saying it on the spot, regardless if it was said 200 years ago by the composer. On the moment they say it, it's now. Carpe diem, on the moment. Live it intensely. It's the intensity of now, the urgency of now. Of course you can argue the instrumentarium, the acoustics, the knowledge of the genre, the studies about the fact of how people danced Sicilianas, how people stylized Sicilianas with dotted rhythm, and how dotted was it, how not too dotted was it, and you have to have enormous examples. So you can and you should study the history of the Siciliana dance before you play the slow movement of the Mozart concerto, except most people don't. Because they learn how to play it, not how to think it. People have thought it for them before. The publishers, the musicologists, the scholars, possibly the conductors when you play the concerto. In other words, like an actor, you become the puppet of the director who says, do it this way and we'll do 100 takes until you do it my way. Even if you can say as an actor, I think I should do it this way, it's more meaningful to the text I have to say, to my lines. But ultimately the director decides which take we keep and how many we take more until we reach what the director imagines to do. Is that really in the hands of the conductor, in the hands of the soloist? Or is it a combination where you collaborate with the conductor and the orchestra musicians. Of course, there's some limitations of tempo with the woodwinds, and they cannot play under a certain tempo without to breathe in the middle of a sentence. So that already takes care of it. And very often, in this very opening of the only adagio of 27, often played slow, plus ritenuto, when the orchestra enters, usually they pick up the tempo. Sorry for this wrong note. Because that's the traction that the orchestra plays. But the piano's opening solo for so many bars can very well isolate itself and play a slower tempo. And why not? Why do we always have to have the rule that the tempo is good for all? First theme, first sonata by Beethoven. Second theme, the one is rising staccato arpeggio of 6/4, like the finale of the 40th Symphony by Mozart. We have some energy drive up. And then the second theme, half major, half minor in the relative F major. A flat major. Oh, it's a sonata form, same pulse, different contrast of the character. That's what we're taught. I was, at least. I don't know if all of you were. But we're taught coherence, structure, construction, architecture. So if I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, I have the unit of the pulse, but do I have enough contrast for the touch? The legato from close-ups, legato, meaning not from above the keys, but and some touches demand longer time to be prepared. And it's not a concerto that you have an accompaniment, but nevertheless, then if you play the second theme's tempo for the first theme, I think you sound more pedantic, I think, for my taste, than driven. And then, so can you allow these differences of tempi? I think you should, but so wise, because when you know, in the end, what matters is where you catch it back. So if you played your second theme under the tempo of the first, and then you have this build-up of the bridge, if very subtly, unnoticeably for the audience, you recoup the tempo that you lost to express the second theme in this driven motoric bridge until this way, when you take the repeat, if you do at the end of the exposition, you're back in the tempo. If not, you'll be, and then you see the incoherence comes either in the repeat, and if you don't do repeat, in the beginning of the development. So is the coherence in the pulse, is the coherence in the thematic material's character or contrast of character? Is the coherence to be gained in the bridges of the motoric elements between the thematic material's expositions into the development? Return to the recap with this very calm, dominant ostinato. So if you are slow before it, you can catch back. It's seemingly steady, idle moment, but you get back into the tempo so you don't arrive. And then it's visible that you are slow and you're catching up too late. So is that only experience? Yes, in part. Is it strategic thinking and organizing ways to lure the audience of knowledgeable or not knowledgeable people, that you keep your tempo but in fact you don't, that you adjust to the moods of the situations of the different thematic materials, but then at the end you give it a coherence through the bridges. Said like this, it sounds like a menu or some kind of IKEA building map of the pieces that you put together. And it sounds so unartistical. You could say, play how you feel, play the expression, count in order to keep the stability of the beats, because you want not to lose tempo and not to gain tempo. And then adjust for the moods as much as you can, but unity of tempo matters. I agree. But I think that the second option is more subtle, in fact. It allows to express more within the same, instead of feeling like for the one theme it's too slow, for the other theme it's too fast. And in Finny, if I ask Ludwig, like, he never answers back. Probably he's deaf. Cheap, very cheap. I'm guilty of cheap humor. But I like to think that we dialogue at our level ways as we want or feel like with the composer, regardless if he's dead or not. What did you want? Of course, had he written it in the full F flat major, I think, with the 6th degree being major, then we would have the flow more naturally. And you play. But the fact that he uses flat 6 to have minor only for the top part, but major in the middle, literally the middle, the third, the mediant, as tear in a smile. So can you take that nano moment to express that it's not totally natural to have a minor 6th in major? It means that there is something sad in this happy relative major. Now, how much do you want to insist on it is how much you put value into it, or into the completion of the whole piece, in terms of the structure construction of it. You can very well say, yes, fine, all that is true, but the pulse prevails. How slow can I play the first theme? Depends on the acoustics and the resonance to see how the staccati are separated by silence or connected by the residue of the sounds, which also gives you a different impression. But let's say, and then, so these two elements are clearly opposite. The one rises, the one drops, the one is in minor but feisty, the one is in major, half minor, and dropping, complaining. Perhaps in a sense you have to have a way to say, well, Beethoven would have liked to have a tiny bit accommodation with the tempo in order to show that duality of the second theme, that is nor major nor minor fully. He would have been, or, but he's sorry. And the augmented second cannot be legato, in my opinion, because it's the harmonic minor, which is not melodic. So you have to separate it and use the appoggiatura push, the tenuto on it, to give that sense of minor ninth dissonance with the bass note. Just like the Chopin ballade. Except in the Chopin ballade is exacerbated, is brought out as an effect of dynamic energy for the motion, that emotion of the desperation. Whenever in Beethoven's second theme, it's withheld down at the bottom. So you suffer, but the pain is silent. Whenever in Chopin, the pain is extroverted open. So that's why for the tempo in Chopin we talk about rubato. How much? If at all. And according to whom? Oh, in my tradition. Oh, my teachers. Oh, in my youth. Oh, the recordings of such and that. And these and those. And at some point I play. I have to endorse the responsibility of my action. So I don't play to please, I play to convince, because the music, beyond being prettiful, is meaningful. And when you hear, there's a statement. I don't know what he says. Is it, I am deeply sorry? Am I deeply dropping from, I don't know, hope? But there is something tragic in this first theme that goes around the leading tone and then drops through the tritone melodically, which is dramatic, if any, and then it's interrupted on the 6th degree, like, I need the 5th again. And then you have the ultimate expression, which is non-melodic. The master of operatic lyricism on the piano, the man who makes the piano sing, mostly with step motion naturally. Here is a single repeated note. So how do you play melodic, stable, but perhaps spoken in syllable, repeated note that each has a different syllable? Perhaps I would like so much to dance with you. I know it's again one of my cheap words. So you feel like the last one should be slightly delayed because it's the downbeat, and here it's a consonance, because the next one will be a dissonance, the famous minor ninth of Beethoven. So you think, okay, that is the case. But if I take in account all this information, emotional, as well as because of that harmonic melodic, do I delay? Do I play together? Do I even delay both? How do I bring out this different from the first time, which is unison? And why didn't he finally make something melodic pianistically to sing? Now we know why, because it's lame, obviously. So sorry for this, but it is a type of demonstration. It's not putting me in light, good light, but I think it's important, because then you have to value how to say melodically the repeated note. Do you repeat it inside the key before it's fully dead? And then what tempo do you take in order for the decay not to happen too early? Compared to plus the rubato if it's ritenuto, perhaps accelerando for the first, and then ritenuto for the last. And if you do too much of both, it becomes like an accordion of tempo, stretch and retract. And for some, this is the meaning of the translation on the piano of Chopinian singing, imitation of the bel canto arias of Bellini or others, of that operatic type of music that Chopin translated on the piano or through the piano. And so, of course, who defines the good taste? How much is enough? How much is not enough? No rubato at all, a little bit more dislocation of the two notes at the arrival point to show even more their ambivalent expression, and then this kind of slight climax. And so who defines the how much, when, how strategically? How do you go for the modulation in G flat and the return and then the build up and then alone before the bass? And fourth variation, or with the 2x2 of the Lament of the Baroque, like Bach Book 1, Book 2, the theme of the prelude. So I have so many retaliation of this original theme. Naked, harmonized, secondary voiced, rich in harmonic and secondary voice materials, components, at which point do you decide to loosen up the tempo to accompany that build-up of the melodic expression that is not restated the same way? And how do you plan that according to a written text that doesn't say perhaps that, or that suggests it, in your opinion, through your analytical eye plus your emotional drive? And that I insist not to be replacing by the analytical organization of the matters that you display from the individual emotional response that your musicianship should translate from the music they receive or you receive, and you transmit to the audience as a vibrant membrane of the piece. In fact, in an ideal world, it should be both. And how do you manage the cocktail of the both? Well, you know what? Everybody has to invent it for themselves, because we all have different level of tolerance, ingredients, expectation, hope, imagination, or perhaps borders of our personal character, psyche, of our personality. You know, I'm reserved. I don't feel like expressing too loud these intimate things because it's indecent. But at the same time, what is indecent for one performer is less indecent for another. And then you go into traditions and into, oh, but I prefer such and such. He does or she does more rubato. That means it's better. But some of them say, not at all. They play better because they don't apply too much rubato. Don't play Chopin too emotional, play it more rational. Others would say there is no romanticism in Bach. Play it all in Chopin in the sense of comparison of time periods. After all, only 99 years, but very busy in evolution of music in our views. Afterwards, chronologically observing between the death of Bach in 1750 and Chopin's in 1849. And Bach, in fact, influenced Mozart more directly than most of the Romantic era composers. But that doesn't mean that it has to be expressed the same way. When I gave you the F minor Book 2 comparison of the appoggiatura with anticipation, which is a lament with chromaticism, which he does already in his three-voice invention, in the same F minor, by the way. All these appoggiaturas, accacciaturas, port de voix. So what does Chopin express? Quasi the same. So either Chopin is neo-Baroque, either Bach is already pre-Romantic. But what do we think about what is romantic and what is sentimental? It's always portrayed by the performers, teachers, or musicologists, or people who define the good taste from the bad taste and publish the publishings, the erudite musicians. It's always connotated. Oh, don't play Bach romantic. Oh, don't play that sentimental. But sentimental is one of the highest levels of humanity. That means that you have humanity. You're not inhumane. Your sentiments are your feelings. That means your inner, I would say, barometer of morality, regardless if it's shared by the religion, the society in general, or is it your own level or for your own cursor that you place on honesty, on earnestness, fine. And so, of course, if you put a rubato, it becomes artificial. It becomes demonstrated. It's no more earnest. It's no more reserved. Sometimes it's more emotional because you don't do it. And you just go... And the listener thinks, okay, he's sad in his expression, but he's going somewhere. And if you do the same tempo, but slightly slower, with more time to express the elements of the affect. So you start dwelling a little more on your own sorrow. It hurts, but it really hurts. She left me, he left me. Will he come back? Whatever the lyrics are in the subliminal hint of the operatic pianism of their aria on the keyboard, this lyricism, of course it's more indulgent. And if on top of it is played slower, plus rubato in the sense of a little forward, a little backwards, like almost zigzagging. So if you hear that in Cortot in the 30s, you say, wow, that's historic, marvelous recording, wow. If somebody else plays it today in a jury, God forbids competition, you'll have jury members say, oh, no, it's tasteless, too much. So, as Charlie Chaplin lost most of the look-alike Charlie Chaplin walking competitions that existed in his youth, the original was dismissed. The copies were preferred because they looked more alike. So in a way, there is a level of truth in that idea that even a little bit of freedom is not per se eccentric. And again, who defines the good taste? Who defines it's too much? The record director, the teacher, the musicologist, the specialized scholar. Somebody has an authority. Somebody writes a book. Somebody writes an article, and many of them do, and they don't agree. But the point is that it creates chapels of beliefs that in this edition we have the authority because it is most authentic to do this edition for Chopin than that. But the other ones are also authentic. And you know that Chopin wrote 3 at least copies, if not with the help of students and friends, to send to several publishers at the same time for each piece. You end up in realizing that there are multiple truths for all these details. But is it details, or is it just through the tempo, the expression of the emotion? And if it was fashionable to be more extroverted at certain time periods in the expression of your artistry, in other time periods it's considered too much. So what was dramatic and accepted as effective becomes laughable and critiqued in another time period. So there's not only styles between the compositions, but there are of course styles within the interpretations of those compositions. Because the canons of beauty evolve, and the gurus of the time define that it's not supposed to be anymore this way, and people follow them because they want to be in the right, in the authentic, and of course in the winning, especially for competitions. And so it creates fashions, it creates those groupments of people who trust and believe in the rubato, others less, others not at all. And it's not as simple as that. It's more subtle than that, more complex than that, more layered than that, more personal than that, less just, had this chicken following whichever new fashion. No, I think that there is a level of personal choice. At the same time, there is a general impression of how everybody else thinks of the piece. And today, more than ever, we can access that on the tip of the finger clicking. So then, in the variety of capacities, of ways of expressing it, how do you choose yours if you are shopping for one across the others for your validation? But the validation should be your understanding of the score, which comes back to the story of my deep belief that analysis is necessary, but only if it's married equally to intuition. All the rest is pedantic. I want to prove a point, and I'll pay to prove my point. Will I sound convincing? Most likely not. Do people care if I'm authentic in my expression? Perhaps not. But most likely the informed audience or the juries who know the pieces you play, who play the pieces you play, who have played the pieces you play, who have taught them, recorded them, re-recorded them, who have an authority on given expertise of expression for romantic or classical or baroque, whatever, more or less Well, depends, but the authority is there, regardless if it's self-declaimed or accepted by others. But the point is, there are diverging points, traditions. I think temperaments, literally, general temperaments. The Nordic people, different from the Southern people, it's a civilization of the inside, protecting from the bad weather that is constantly there, like or then the civilization of the outdoors, where you can think about the point of world all night long and still go in the morning refreshed. You don't fight the elements to think. In the other case, you do. And so it creates a sense of hold back, hold in. And the other ways, they appear for these who hold in to be too extroverted. And that translates in the tempo. It is translates in the expression. The tempo is not just the speed, it's the psychological expression of the thematic materials which translate the human nature's translation through music artificially of art form of life. It's another person, a way of poetry or painting or sculpting or filming in today or video gaming in tomorrow. And it is another form of living art. And you have to know the style, you have to define it for your performance with the capacities of technique to control it within the tempo you would like. You impose it, or you compose with the one of the conductor, or you try to adjust, adapt with the chamber musicians or by yourself. And sometimes you let your intuition create a sense of beautiful and incredibly ephemeral moment. Let's say I play for you the beginning of the slow movement of the Schubert Last Sonata, which he wrote a few months before. The sonata is a funeral march for Beethoven's funeral, personal homage. It wasn't performed, since Schubert was not a performed composer in Vienna nevertheless. And he wrote this in C sharp minor. So I just played for you as I naturally felt it now. Of course, I know the piece for 40 years, so I could have gone. And you would say, God, it's too slow. I lose the point of the sentence. The vowels are too extroverted. The syllables prevail on the words that they construct. But others could say, but I have more time to reflect. And if I play with more pedal and less slow, and I try to control my melody in the thirds, the keys to be played from close up, not to appear too busy. Because if I do in this tempo with fingers articulation, I'll sound. And you'll say, oh, it's too fast. No, in fact, it's too busy in the re-articulation. But if I can play ta-ha and not ta-ta, I delay, but I have the resonance, and I blossom the second note into its heart of the beat, on the bottom of the beat. And I justify the anticipation of the one note before. There is a common tone between the two thirds, F sharp. If I replay it fully, I hear ta-ta. But if I don't replay it fully, but half inside the keys, ta-ha, what do I gain? I gain a legato of the phrase, a connection of the line. And that tempo could be slower or faster. I still have that meaning, not just beauty. But because the piano with the pedal and the acoustics allows me to stretch it beyond what any other instrument or singer would do, if I'm so deeply convinced, why not? So most people will play it one tempo to make sure they don't displease the jury. And others will play it another tempo because they can't control it if not, as I showed it to you. And so they adjust what they can from what they could or what they should in some kind of mix that is not clear exactly which choice is for what. But then where is the personal choice? The personal risk taking? I don't say risk taking in the sense that a soldier goes to die or to live. No, I don't speak of that. Of course not. I speak about taking responsibility of the way you're going to manage your phrase, your arrival point, where all this is guiding you. And so, of course, in the given context of the other movements and the acoustic in the hall and other pieces performed in the concert, people can differently appreciate, criticize, or like your choice of tempo, which might be not the same in another acoustic with another instrument and another program of pieces around it. I always think it reveals itself differently every time, even if so detailedly. It's like looking at the prism and the light goes through it differently and you rediscover it in a way that is almost unbelievably multiple. And you wonder how many more ways can it reveal itself to me, because it seems infinite. Of course, you cannot start playing with doubts. In order to implement, you have to have convictions. And then you deal with the unexpected. As I said, the keys answer more or less well of the given piano and the given acoustic, the way you perceive things, or perhaps you think that people are bored, or you think that people are agitated, or you think your playing is not exactly as you dreamed it, because sometimes inside our head we idealize things, and when it comes out, even in composition it happens, less in performance. So you have to match the intent with the extent. And it goes through notated scores that teachers and students spend their life looking at. What does it mean? What does it say? What did he suggest? A little bit, not too much. How do you balance the pedal, the phrasing, the articulation, the balance? Yeah. But on this piano, it's going to be okay. You could allow yourself that. And the student feels almost, perhaps not always expecting to receive the authorization to dare, but somehow seeking some kind of validation, at least. And most of the time, the student searches validation with other pianists than the teacher on YouTube today or yesterday on recordings, tomorrow on who knows what platform style. That's only the technology. The point is that the validation should come from inside us. And to have that, you have to have enough analysis to understand, choose, and organize. Then try to put what it means to you within that. Of course, you can say, I wish he had done it in sixths. It's more expressive to me than in thirds. Mademoiselle Boulanger used to tell me, because I was often commenting when I was sight reading beautiful pieces like this, not because I was taught or allowed by her to be arrogant and go, he should have done this, as if, who am I? Nobody. Who's Beethoven, Schubert, Beethoven, Brahms, and all this. I know very well that. But then she used to answer to me, no, when you play his piece, try to play it at best what you think he wrote. Or through his writing, he meant, obviously, that's what she wanted to say, obviously. And if you don't get convinced by what you do, or what he, she, if it was a woman composer, obviously make it do, then write your own piece from the get-go, from the ground up, and do what you like there to express. So I didn't shy doing that. All my life I have composed, not because it's a game that I can play because I am gifted at it and it's fun, or I'm a little bit less humble than others and I can think, my music is worth writing down and leaving in case somebody likes it. No arrogance, really no. And when I say that, probably people think, he's saying that because he is. Okay, it's a perverted game, but I will start to answer to those who think that I'm falsely humble by saying that when people honor me by playing my music, not the way I have imagined it, I'm thanking them. I'm not bugging them. I'm not saying, nee, 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 nee. This way is my way or your way is wrong, No. I go, wow, I never thought about this that way. Of course I didn't. The music revealed itself to me when I composed it. It didn't reveal itself in a variety of interpretations. It revealed itself in one interpretation that came with the creation of the piece that came from me. From inside me, rather, I meant to say. Is it a reminiscence? Is it a novelty? Who knows? Daydream, real dream, organized dream, or how much then technique in composition you have to make up with the intuition. It's a bit the same as interpretation to find the right balance of the two. But nevertheless, the interpretation of my pieces that is not matching the way I imagined them when I gave birth to them, so to say, it's only a gift that I receive. That means that it means so much to somebody else, a fellow human, that as we do when we teach or play ourselves composers who are dead, because we love their music, not because we're afraid of betraying them while on the way. That's what we do. We try not to betray them by studying, learning, reading, and all that. But in fact, we play what it means to us. It could evolve through life, but we do. And I find that when somebody plays something that means to them from a music that meant to me to write, to bring out, and to live out, and not even work with me about it in terms of preparation of performance, just the music itself and what it meant to them by reading it, or him, German music or whatever, I receive it as a gift. So I don't pretend to think that Beethoven and Mozart receive my teaching or my performing of the interpretation of my or the students of mine is a gift. They don't need my gift, and probably where they are, they far don't care about it. They left it already, beyond and besides themselves, for us to, as Manasseh Boulanger used to say, serve the piece regardless of the composer. It's the work that we worship, that shines over us, and that we play in order to shine for all of us. It's a service, serving the muse, beyond all personal considerations, though they're interesting in biographical aspects, but no. So she said, if you don't play exactly what he wrote, to the closest of your consciousness calling you to do right, then write your own music. And in turn, then, she didn't say that, but I notice it, if you feel betrayed, then you feel only served. Which means that your music could mean something else differently in the interpretation than the way you thought of it. It's not canceling yours, it's adding to yours. It's a richness of another layer, another point of view, another emotional view. And if they don't play it because it means to them, then it doesn't touch them. So it's perhaps bad, or perhaps they didn't reach to it, it didn't reach to them. Meaning the text itself, not me personally, of course. If that's not humility, truly so, to accept the difference, to welcome it, I don't know what it is. Oh, of course, in absolute terms, all this is narcissistic. It's my music, they play me, who am I? I understand that you could very well have this opinion in comparison to the true altruism, to the true abnegation, to the true selflessness. I'm sure some are more selfless than me, and I'm not competing. I'm not trying to impress anybody by being more selfless or less selfless, more rubato or less rubato, more expressive, more romantic, less romantic, more sentimental, less sentimental, more rhythmic, less rhythmic, more tempo keeping, more tempo not keeping. I just wanted to say that I believe that the tempo, in a way, is our breath, is our heartbeat. It's what makes us have all these thoughts, contradictory or complementary, innocent or strongly disturbing, sad or happy, but it gives us that life, the pulse of life. And we have to put together the knowledge of it with the layers of the music and our way of quoting it through our psyche and presenting it through our technique. Failing if we cannot play it well according to what we intended or what we thought we intended, we understood of the piece. It's always a riddle at the end, almost. But it's fact. And so we feel like we are closer to what we wanted at some point. We feel so proud of ourselves. In fact, nobody noticed. It sounded perhaps the same. So it's a lot of thoughts for very little of things. It's almost like you say in French, a tempest in a glass of water. But we are in the water. We are in the element. We are immersed in this piece. We are immersed in this thought process. We're immersed in that rhythmic tempo drive that brings around the emotion at certain level of tempo that brings it to more be vibrant and to be more emotional and more tragic or more flamboyant or more just incredibly happy. Yeah, the tempo, I think, is the pace of our life as musicians. The way we hold ourselves through the section. And then the next. And then the following. And then the next movement. And then the next piece. And then the next day. And the next reiteration. And the next rehearsal. And little by little, in some ways, some of the unclear situations become clearer while making it, while serving it, while living it, while failing it. Part of all is that too. Finally, the tempo is nature. After all, art imitates nature, art imitates humanity, art imitates, in fact, it's the mirror of our being, the interior being, the invisible being. Perhaps it's the soul of it. Here is the seasons going through. It's important to accept that. The breathing of the elements. The light, the shadow, the day, the night, all these are givens. The rising sun, the sun setting. Oh. In fact, the more we study, the more we learn, the more cultivated we get, the more paradoxically, sometimes even erudite for some of us. The more it's a bottomless pit. I used to have students who said something so sweet after making them write a piece on their studying for piano by Bach by hand to copy in order to immerse oneself in the texture of the thinking process of the composer. When trying to play it again afterwards, the awareness of more stuff was more difficult to manage in the performance. And they said, or they realized, and that was a very beautifully healthy statement, I would say, mentally, when they said ignorance was bliss. I took that very seriously, thinking, okay, the more is not always the better. And if knowledge, revealing facts of the piece we play, we study at other levels than finger memory for pianists, is probably to be taken very cautiously. After all, there is the industry of playing. There is the pleasure of pushing the keys. There is the desire to compose through one's own incredible variety of very subtle touch. Some kind of piece over the piece that is the interpretation. And the over-awareness of what's happening doesn't help always, at least not right away. It's a full circle story to get to the point to which you can integrate in your intuitive art making, whichever form it takes, of course, but when it's performance, one should expect that a lot of the brain processing goes into playing. And I'm a piano teacher. I want to integrate all the elements that it takes to play the piece, besides the understanding, the analysis, the true, profound awareness that will ultimately help you deliver it with a subtle amount of layer over the piece itself, so that your interpretation doesn't become essentially a restatement over the statement of the composer's work, once you take in account the pulse, the possible suspensions, or perhaps syncopations, perhaps triplets that break the flow of the 16th notes, all elements of the texture in the context of the composer's choices that you have to present in your performance without to overstate, while being aware of them. And sometimes the problem is that to find the right tempo, which is the fundamental question, the pacing of the storytelling, the necessary function of a rubato to take the time to say when something needs a little more than the beat that is allowed to be played through. Was it taken in account by the composer? Perhaps it was, when they write a hemiola over a bar line and changes the pace of the pulse, not per se of the tempo in terms of stop and start or slow down and restart faster. That's a little bit not too subtle. In turn, I find that intuition is really, call it talent, let's put it this way, is an incredible power that one senses, that connects us to the texture to which we cling on as if we are one with the piece. Not so much because of the playing, or that's how it translates itself in the pianist's pianism, but through the capacity of the ear to detect all these elements intuitively, for most, in fact. And that's a defeat, perhaps, of over-knowledge or over-analysis or over-layering or over-voicing, for which I plead guilty. I do. Perhaps I should be aware that not all musical textures mean the same way to students or to their individual artistic capturing capacity of it. And therefore, yes, I feel compelled, like all teachers, I guess, and I'm sure most do, to give the best of our comprehension of the piece to the students, not to replace theirs because we consider it, or perhaps we do actually sometimes, wrong. Though wrong and right in art, it's another story. But even so, let's say that you have to guide a student. You have to establish, especially with younger students who are in search of their own guidelines, which they'll apply throughout once you give them, as a teacher, guidelines about it. Some things can be adapted in different even genres, let less more of the same. And in a way, you teach them how to think, you teach them how to feel, not what they feel, because that's they do. You cannot teach them to feel. But you can teach them to read through the leaves, to read through the lines, to in fact, you reveal to them what they already know, but they don't put words on it. My teacher used to say for me that she was, when teaching me, unpeeling the orange. So if it's more about revealing through your knowledge to the student what the student knows already, feels already, senses already, is having an awareness already, doesn't have the words to say it so. And after all, what are words? The words are what? Are communication, of course, but do we really explain the piece? Obviously we do in part, at least the visible part. The structure, the organization, the thoughts, the development, the traveling through this or that tonality. Yeah, we do create a map for the path that the piece takes, and then pianistically, when you teach, you make sure that they can go through all the difficult sections with fingerings, with positioning of wrists, of flexibility of knuckles for fingers that are perhaps rigid, especially the thumb. You organize so that the texture, the context, the tonality, therefore the topography of the keyboard in different tonalities calls for different ways. And of course, each hand is different in terms of its size, flexibility, stretching between fingers. Of course, as a student, you know that you have to repeat until you make it. As a teacher, you think we can give the student wisdom how to play each section that results in what the composer wished. And so in a way, ideally, we should be able to constantly ask the composer to adapt to certain aspects, especially evolution of instrument. But since we play music of composers, mostly of the past, on instruments of today, this is impossible. So the teacher is a hyphenation between what we assume is the composer's, how can you call that? I call it intent, but it's perhaps more than that. The composer's imagination of what is there to be discovered. And sometimes I'm fear because I'm so impassionate in transmission of the intensity and subtlety and details, of course. Devil is in the detail of all these elements, that I'm afraid against my own self that I push too much towards voicing. Perhaps there is something as over voicing though deep inside me I don't believe it. But it would be arrogant not to question one's beliefs in order to find perhaps deeper truths, more humility and adjustment, adaptation to situations where you think my solution to which I got in through my life in companionship with this music might be not the best solution for the student who is meeting this piece for the first time in their life. And they will develop their own kinship with the piece. They will teach in turn themselves this piece. They will travel through life in the companionship of this piece in different pacing than mine, or alike, or whatever. In other words, they might, how will they even recall, understand, and treat the texture of these pieces that they studied with me, let's say, when they teach them in turn in depth or in detail as well as in meaning to students of theirs who in turn will become their disciples. I don't believe that is a rigidity of knowledge, acceptance of a true way compared to wrong ways. I believe that, and that's very humbling. We all face every time at the different, obviously, seasons of our lives, the same questions when playing the same piece. I thought when I was young that I'll know it all by now about it. How silly, and of course completely naive, and mostly not very smart of mine. Perhaps because I was surrounded as a child by very old people in music. They all carried a sense of truth by just incarnating their own music making. They didn't need to explain that much theoretically, actually. Well, some did. Mademoiselle Dieudonné, Mademoiselle Boulanger, of course. But some more through their playing. That was Richter, that was Khachaturian, that was Bernstein. They didn't have that pedagogical calling for themselves to explain, to dissect, to find causality and root cause and then solutions. Why and what came to be and how it came to become. And then usually for the tempi, for instance, it was they play and they say that's how it's supposed to be. And they didn't worry so much about how I could adapt or adopt what they would suggest. No, they didn't suggest, they imposed. Richter especially. Why especially? Because Richter, in fact, Richter was a very curious mind with very strong beliefs. And I think his playing was built in not childhood, but later in life. And I think for that aspect, he was atypical in his transmission of thoughts. Also, he was a force of nature in terms of his huge torso for his shorter legs and his amount of weight he could put on his arms without to create a tendinitis, ironing the keyboard in an incredible amount of intense sound production. And therefore the tempi for him were not related to an analytical aspect of things. The tempi, as he was rehearsing always as if he didn't know the pieces in concert halls, under tempo just for the articulation of the details in the hand playing. The tempi were very intuitive, very, very intuitive. And I've heard him often play Beethoven sonatas in various situations, private concerts, public concerts, wherever I was around. And I noticed that he allowed a lot to his gut instinct to dictate him the pace he'll take. Some kind of ecstatic Schubert movement in slower than slow tempo for some. Well, everybody has a different opinion, obviously, but or then some absolutely overdriven tempi in some Beethoven allegros that became fiery, and this combination of being Slavic and German, obviously, his father, gave him this kind of sense of exploring beyond boundaries. Perhaps that's what I felt. He was profoundly free. So was Rostropovich, profoundly free in their approach to music. It was directly between the score and them, and they didn't allow too much of analysis, opinions, attitudes. Once they found the synergy with their playing of the piece, it was obvious, evident. And of course, the very long fingers of Rostropovich allowed him even to play piano examples that were just fantastic. And you feel like this kind of people who were headstrong as a conductor, as a pianist, as a companion of great composers like Prokofiev, Shostakovich in those days in Russia, Soviet days. It was clear to me that they didn't teach like Mademoiselle Boulanger through analysis of the texture. They taught me, at least, a lot more through their animal instinct, if I may call it so. Not to belittle at all, but a fact. And I am here to testify about that. Bernstein, oh my God, if that was an animal instinct in music, there is hardly more, less to say more, or more to say less. Suffice to hear him play the slow movement of the Ravel concerto to understand the deepest intensity of sensual connection of sounds, of tension and releases, of shadows and lights, of Weltschmerz, pain, and daydream relief, of some kind of deep anxiety. Identification with the piece's purpose, or extracting from the piece something that means to his psyche. I don't think he shied too much from extraordinarily overstretching the tempi in Mahler, conducting, rehearsing with orchestras of different types, student orchestras or professional orchestras. And I recall that tempi that he took in the Shlomo by Bloch with Rostropovich in a recording session in Paris. He really didn't try to think in any way, shape, or form as somebody who's trying to make a synthesis. So what does it mean? How can I translate it? But not too much. No, he went for the too much. He did. And it was so exciting to hear him do it, to watch him ask it from the musicians in the orchestra, to obtain it. And because of his charisma and his, perhaps it was also the times where people were more obedient to authority, natural or imposed, perhaps both, that his tempi, the music that came out of it, the musicians of the orchestra who played under him were fascinated. Not sure they were convinced, and they didn't have time to think because they had to rise up to the challenge of this extremely slow tempi that allow for so much to be explored within a given crescendo between two rhythmic values. They have to extend their breath, they extend their bow. It's as if he inquisitively obtained more from them about the piece than what they were used to already very much so give of themselves. Physically, literally, especially when the music comes from the breath through the wind playing or singing. Was it unnatural as Richter's, let's say, Schubert sonatas, very extended tempi for some like the last one? And who's to define what is simplicity and natural? Of course, some people will say andante is not adagio, adagio is not this, and that. Yes, we can define it, we can explain it, we can conduct it in 2, in 4, subdivide or not, or if you cannot, at least help better the phrasing. So everybody defines their own sense of what is natural, and teachers say plead with simplicity, but the texture is not simple. The intent of the melodic line's arrival point is at least the horizon line of it. But when you play a slower tempo, the horizon line extends. Everything becomes ecstatic. You find in slower tempi that you hear more things happening than in a faster tempo, but the faster tempo gives a sense of flow, of direction, of meaning. You feel like you're more comforted, almost it's like a solace. And sometimes slower tempi, beyond the fact of being difficult to be performed, by themselves question more the listening, the hearing, the meaning we give to music, not just the enjoyment or the excitement of how we perform it. There is a level of narcissism in tempi changes, especially when they're in the slow tempo. An idea of I can sustain that longer breath. I can sustain that decay of the instrument, especially in the piano, in order to create an extended, held bridge of the melodic line that leads me here and there. And until I get there, I'll take more time from here. And if I do it, it's because it means to me. For the affect, for the effect, for the deep musical emotion that the piece provides me. In fact, the conductor is the reflection through their gestural precision of conducting to obtain the elements through the multitude of people together, compared to the pianist who obtains it only from him or herself, or doesn't obtain it. That's another story to be not taken lightly. Do we always succeed in our intents? No. Blame it on the piano, blame it on the acoustic, blame it on the audience. Oh, they coughed. Oh, it was terrible. It wasn't my day. I was tired, jet lagged. Of course, all this should be taken into account. So when you teach in absolute terms, you don't teach with all these elements in account. You don't tell the student, well, when you'll be jet lagged and tired, your phrasing won't be this, it'll be that. You cannot teach, and you shouldn't, I guess. Well, some people can argue that. Teach how to play according to the different physical and psychological situations in which you find yourself, but you still have to perform. Who are we? Passing by in front of the piece and saluting it through our ears, hearing it, our eyes reading it, our fingers playing it. And when we find some kind of harmony of this combination, or some synergy of all these elements that fit in with incredible sense of simplicity, because they obey the direction of the phrase. The arrival point is meaningful, even if stretched, or even if not stretched. I still think that therefore the tempo choosing fundamentally is really the pacing of our storytelling. It can divert us from that point of arrival of the phrase. It can make us even lose the thread that leads us to it. To a certain extent, we play with fire when we play only with our intuition. But sometimes the intuition helps us reach levels of awareness of the piece that words can't explain. Of course, the ultimate wisdom would be to say nothing. Just listen, play, perhaps give an example, and then let the student profoundly macerate their tea leaves of their musicianship with what you suggested through your playing, rather than through your explanation. It's the defeat of the analytical teaching. It's all about only fusional, like invisible fluids transmission, like radio waves. Perhaps that's the ultimate wisdom in teaching, is not to speak. If that's the case, I failed, since I'm a talker, as you obviously know, if you're watching or hearing me speak. Thinking loud voice thumb concepts and thinking, rethinking the paradigm of teaching through the meaning of the piece I teach, that is not singular but plural, though evolving convictions bring you to question your own certitudes, and you say, oh, I knew that was the way to do it, but then now I discovered different ones. And I find that the most humbling as a teacher, and I will never repeat it enough, as I already do, how much I learned from students, how much I'm grateful and humbled that it allows me, through their fresh view of the piece, to rethink the piece myself, instead of only delivering a rigidified, by the experience nevertheless, but rigidified way of saying, it's only one way, it's my way. You came to me for this, I give it to you, deal with it. It's perhaps not as direct as that, or as simplistic as that. After all, it's more subtle than that, obviously, but it has something to do with that. If we only teach our experience, I don't think it's very deeply meaningful, because it's limited. What we teach, in fact, is how to continuously learn from the piece for our students in their own future. In fact, we teach them, I believe, how they will be teaching it to themselves through their own students. rather than just how to teach them to play it now for the inevitable necessity of a jury audition exam competition, which is part of their curriculum and their proving to their peers that they're worth of this and that in the trade for which they are involved. It will forever remain a deeply philosophical way of transmission. Though the fingers play, and sometimes we watch them play. Sometimes we have the impression that we direct them to play. Being the conductor and the performer at the same time of ourselves when we perform solo, most of the time. Pianists, we trend, we hear, we organize, we seem to be in charge of things, tempo, but through the playing as well, not only through the thinking, since we're not disconnected of the making. So the industry of playing imposes a large part the tempo choices too. And you have to take all this in account. For each individual physiology, morphology of hands, of hearing capacity, of developing it, and the more you develop the hearing, the more you obtain from the fingers, the more you get fingerings from your teacher that allow you to go further into the layering or the expressing of the textures, complexity. Manhattan and Albanese and Sati, obviously, simplicity is in one, complexity is in the other, but ultimately clarity, transmission of the texture through your playing. Your playing is evocative of talking, of singing, of exclamation, of yearning. Whatever it is that you perceive, it's in the piece or in the section, and how you connect the sections and how you manage the bridges, and how therefore you can reconnect with the tempo that you might have lost by expressing a thematic material. I think it's all to be very importantly flexible while holding the structure. This kind of like car suspensions in bumps that keeps the car floating over and going on. It feels like, yes, the tempo should be our variable of adjustment for different musical experiences that the piece brings us very strongly, in fact. What will we do without that? We have to take it in account. We cannot play it as if we're just allowing notes, scores that fill up our recitation, and we just declaim things in which we believe more or less, because after all, many did say it before us. We listen to how they did. We do ourselves. Okay, that's part of it, but it's not all of it. I think all of it is to always think, what does it mean to me and how can I mean it better? It's not a natural thing for each student to question themselves that philosophically deeply. So you have to have at the same time the practice room coach attitude to help them with the very playing of the piece, and at the same time to help them with a very hearing, inquisitive hearing of the piece. What do they perceive of the texture? How do they translate it in their playing through their fingers, through their intellect, through their soul, if you call it, for the heart of things, Do they perform it in a complete musicianship, or do they perform it in instrumental knowledge? Do they have necessity to choose? Can they combine? Do they have awarenesses of all these things? You raise more awarenesses, which in a way raise more questions, and could lead to when students tell you, like some did, as I told you, that ignorance was bliss, because in a way it is. And so in order to take advantage of all these awarenesses and reinstall them in the playing, the joy, the pleasure of playing, touching the keyboard, shaping the keyboard's textures like a sculptor of sounds, that you feel with some pianos better than with others, because it is a rapport, a physical rapport of the tips of the fingers that touch the keys through the action, the string, and therefore the resolution of a resonance until it's slightest decay moment where you can pick it up to connect to the next note. So you feel like you're traveling with the sound decay, that you're following with your ear, and then you're connecting to the phrase's meaning that at least you want to put into it. And therefore the tempo takes care of it all, because either it's too slow and it breaks the thread of the melodic line's direction and arrival point, or it's too fast and you cannot simply play all of it because so much is going on at the same time. The pedal, the acoustics, the resonance, how people perceive, how your intent is betrayed by your technique, or perhaps you thought you projected what you thought you did, and at the recording session you listen, you go, oh, it doesn't sound at all like what I thought I put input in my playing. The tempo is something that is part of the expression. It's slightly outside of us, but it's also within us. And when you make a recording and you can restart a piece or a section, the tone engineer would wisely play for you the pulse of the tempo of your preceding take, just in case they're going to have to make an edit. It's compatible, because each take is slightly different for every way, every detail, every intention that you put into it. Ideally, you should play it in one single arched phrasing expression. And you feel like you're constructing something, that you're like a bird soaring in the sky, and you don't let this phrase drop until you reach the ultimate arrival point of it. And then the tempo with the acoustic corresponds to that in incredible intention. And you say, oh, I failed, oh, I dropped too early, oh, I this or that, or I slowed down before I needed to. On the spot, it felt very natural and meaningful to do, but when you listen to it without to play in the take, that you listen headphones or loudspeakers, whatever, you realize, oh no, I should keep that. I was on the right track. Why did I sidetrack myself by the expression of this detail or that other detail? Sometimes you do it intuitively on the spot. Sometimes you have to discipline yourself not to follow the intuition in order to structure your phrasing organization of thoughts. In other words, you teach yourself more than you're taught by somebody, because you hear yourself what you did compared to what you intended. And so you can retake, and hopefully a full take arching the phrase without editing allows you to have the detail and the completion of the direction of the line, especially when some of this romantic music, 19th century music, has those lines that have no end, almost like run-on sentences, just like mine. Talk, talk, talk. But mine are talk. Whenever theirs are heavenly displacing of breath, of emotion. music speaks to us in such different amount of layers and levels. Is it a perfume? Is it a light? Is it a shadow? Is it a smile, a gaze? How does it charm us? And we don't really know exactly, but we feel it. And then how do we transmit that charmed connection with the piece? Do we betray it? Do we over up, up, well, obviously there is a necessity to adopt it. And in a way, perhaps we belittle it through our psyche's capacity to perceive all what it's in there. So we have a level of appropriation of the piece that evolves with us in time, but I guess we cannot fight that. It's just the way it is. And at some point, we think we've reached a level of truth in our quest. It's not truth versus, well, non-truth, obviously. No, I think it's a sense of, I think I found the right pacing with the right weight of the keys of this piano, and I can finally have the resonance and the length of sound that allows me to bridge before the decay of the sound. So once you find that very subtle combination of elements that ally themselves in order for you to express without to think that you betray what you are saying musically. And then you say, if it could be captured now, I think it's going to be right. Today we can record to capture, but very often the best moments when we play it might not be recorded. And fine, that makes us in fact live with the ephemeral hope that every time we start the piece again, we try to restate it with all what's in it, or what we think it's in it, or what we think it's important to show that's in it. And we should always remain open-minded to accept that others see differently in it, and not per se because they're wrong. If that is factually what most of us think. In order to get to some truth, we have to, I guess, adopt the fact that and think that the others are wrong if they don't think like us. If they don't understand it like us, they don't express it like us. And so after all, why should they? It's human nature. Here is a concrete example. Analytically, the end of the first movement of the 31st Sonata by Beethoven finishes in 3/4, as all the first movement is having that key signature. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then the second movement, 1, which is allegro, and the first is slow. Okay, now, when you observe a 3/4, 1, 2, 3, 1, you count the quarter notes in 3/4. That makes sense. 3, but if you observe the last two bars and you align them in a 3-2 combination of two bars becoming one with larger steps instead of 3/4, 3/2 notes, 1, 2, 3 for the last rest, and if you keep that pace of the half note, it becomes the whole note of the double 2/4 bar of the next movement. 1, 2, 3, 4. So now, without explaining, I play with that ratio. Now, you can also intuitively consider that this is not implemented in the notation or the addition in any way or form, shape, and suggesting this ratio between. And you just play for the tempo that you need, as slow as you feel it. As fast as you feel it. Why not? It's fast, it's driven, it's fun, is incredibly exciting. And in fact, there is no indication if this allegro is allegro, or is it presto, or is it prestissimo. Of course it's allegro, it's not presto, but that remains only in the wording. There is no metronomic indication, because the metronome was barely marketed in Vienna by Melzel, but Beethoven didn't mark for his sonatas, just for some of his symphonies, most of them, even retroactively, the ones before it was marketed. But the point is that then the tempo is part of the emotion, of the drive, of the expression. It doesn't always have to be, or at all, analytically organized so that it has some kind of ratio. I personally find that the two movements are very connected. At the ending of the first movement doesn't finish on a downbeat and doesn't finish with a tonic. Could have been, and then start. But that's a subjective opinion. I like that idea that there might be a pulse that unifies the first two movements. I thought about this with the preceding sonata number 30. Opus 109, and its fast second movement, almost the same kind of two halves of a single movement, slow and fast. Naturally, that would be in two beats, or in a bar beat of a beat a bar. 1, 2, 1, 2, or 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, how do I know it's not 1, 2, 3, 4? Because it says prestissimo. Now, of course, prestissimo means very rushed. Allegro, very lively, very happy. And while I agree that there is a wording that matters between allegro and presto, prestissimo, that gives me the illusion that the 2/4, while still a barre beat, is less fast than the barre beat of 6/8. So a conductor can think about it other than by performing it, just in the, as I say, cerebral construction of the architecture of the pulse of the piece, but disconnected from the playing of it. And the pianist plays it. By playing it, what the pianist does is follow in a way the fingers like a dog on a leash, and then depend of them. There are more things happening then. So then does it mean we have to adjust the tempo or start a little less fast in order to be? Of course, the agility practicing and articulation and fingering helps a lot to organize it. We have the dynamic range to take in account. It says piano forte. Forte piano at times it could be compared to modern piano, mezzo forte. So take that also in account, the dynamic range, the ranges used in the piano between this and this, the tonic, the dominant. You cannot isolate the tempo, or you shouldn't, rather, I think. One shouldn't isolate the tempo from the texture, the context, and the dynamic ranges, and the instrument, not to mention the acoustic, and not talking about the pedal. That's why I was mentioning earlier the importance of finding the right rapport between intuition, in a way, not rational, but just by the connection to the piece as it talks to you through your musicianship personally. And then the rational, analytical organization of ratios. That is factual here. Is it right? Did he intend it? Well, it's in the eye of the beholder, but I find that at the end some decision has to be taken. Do we privilege in the sonata the form and therefore the structure and possibly the rhythmic and pulse ratio rapports? Or do we think of it only by the emotional, and it is not only but also, if not constantly, the first importance, that's what attracts us to the piece. Perhaps everybody is attracted differently to it and does a different mix of the two, if any desire to mix anything. So my role ends here. I offer, I suggest, I display, and I see how much I convince the student. And if the student is not convinced, at least not now, they might turn to it later after tried other things. Or perhaps they'll just apply it now just to please the teacher, which I don't mind. I mean, okay, that shouldn't be the case, but you know, we're only human. No, in fact, I think, to be honest, it's nice to exchange with the student how they hear it, what it means to them, and if this ratio of combining movements with single pulse for a certain amount of beats that gives that impression of unity in the diversity of the characters in the thematic materials. Wow, that's fascinating, isn't it? None of my teachers told me about 110 like that for this sonata number 31. So it's not like I'm carrying a tradition that I'll impose on the students on behalf of what I received. In this case, not. I didn't receive it. It's actually, as a performer, I always was bothered by the not understanding why it's not more definitely closing with a certain better or more conclusive ending with a tonic and a downbeat instead of the 10th and a middle beat. But okay, fine. Doesn't say per se that the two movements are connected in the pulse unit. And so it's through the many times I teach that I have to rethink the question when I share it with a student in order to find a solution that is meaningful to the student to adopt or not. But I came up with this thinking, oh, there must be perhaps that reason there. Now, I'm possibly totally wrong, that Beethoven personally never intended it, or perhaps he was in his subconscious, or perhaps he was not consciously meaning it and he didn't have to indicate it. Or perhaps I read too much into it. That's probably the danger of being over-analytical. I guess it's a never-finished research to find the right balance between the intuition and the knowledge.